prefer standing because I tend to move around, so it's also, I think you can see me better from the back. So again, thank you to all the organizers, and I'm really happy to be here and see, meet a lot of new people and also see a lot of old friends. I guess it's a bit disappointing to read the title of the panel because it says past and present, and we're just talking about the past, but I hope to convince you that even if we talk about mystics of the 8th century, they are still very relevant today, maybe more than ever. So in case there were any doubts as to where I got the title of my paper from, it is indeed from Simon and Garfunkel's piece, Sound of Silence. This is the first verses in the lyrics. And as you can see, they talk about darkness, vision, and sound of silence. And it's quite mystical and very apophatic, but don't worry, I won't, my paper won't be an apophatical reading of 60s music, because I just found it interesting that the sound of silence really encapsulates what I want to talk about, namely spiritual hearing. So the background to my own interest in this is, first of all, the collected studies edited by Paul Gavrilouk, who you should all know, and Sarah Coakley on the spiritual senses, perceiving God in Western Christianity. This is really important because it gave me the idea to study an entire realm or an entire array of authors that were ignored in the book, namely Eastern and specifically Syriac authors, mystical authors on spiritual perception. The other book that serves as background, and Susan Harvey is also here, so I'm very happy about that, is a study on the Syriac tradition, on the senses. Well, the book focuses on scent and smell, or the olfactory imagination in ancient Christianity. It has a more broader scope. It's not focused on spiritual, the technical meaning of spiritual perception, but it also helped me to sort of formulate my own questions, and that's just the title page of my PhD, which I defended last year, on the spiritual senses in the Syriac tradition. So it's a sort of combination of the foci of the two books. And I hope to finish an English version of the book by the end of this year. So this is just the background of my interest in the topic. On the outline of my paper today, I will just give one Platonic antecedent to spiritual hearing, which I find really interesting and I think quite ignored. Then I will talk a bit about Evagrius. Basically, just short parenthesis, my PhD was actually a study of the reception of Evagrius' conception of spiritual perception, because he is the most important author for the adoption of spiritual senses in the Syriac East, in my opinion. So I will talk briefly about Evagrius. These are two subpoints which we can either discuss or skip. It's just because the translation and reception of Evagrius theologically is very difficult or very complicated for Evagrius and for the Arabic corpus. I will talk a bit about one passage in the corpus of Dionysius that is also relevant to the discussion, and then I will focus on spiritual hearing in Joseph Hazael, who is an 8th century mystic. So one important point for me is that as I said, there is a technical meaning to spiritual perception. Of course, the Bible and the early Christian literature is full of the language of the senses, also related to the knowledge of God. But the very technical or philosophical complex meaning of spiritual perception is connected to sort of influence or interest or overlap of interest between Platonic and Christian worldviews and concepts. So I propose that, I mean, some of them are fairly obvious, but I think it's nice to put them in a list. There are some shared ideas and concepts between latently Platonism and Christian asceticism and mysticism that sort of facilitate this exchange of concepts between the two groups. So beyond the polemics, and of course Plato is also seen as the source of all heresies through his philosophy, but at the same time latently Platonism has a lot of common points with Christian asceticism, at least, or most of all, with the Evagrian stream, if you want. So first of all, of course, we can start from the assertion that there is a sensible realm and an intelligible realm. The latter, this is important, the noetic realm is more real than the former. The senses are just an image of the former, of the noetic world. The human soul consists of a rational and a twofold irrational and passionate part. This is something shared by Christian ascetics as well. Evagrius' asceticism is based on this distinction. The current state of the soul is imperfect. Human beings have an inclination to the senses, to passions, which has to be purified. This is also something you find in Plotinus, Porphyry, and other latently Platonic authors. The proper activity, and that means the ergon, the real being, the real activity of the mind is contemplation. That's the highest activity of the human being. Human access to the intelligible and to God requires a purification, ideally a sort of impassibility, apatheia, which is not only a Stoic concept, and I want to stress this point. Evagrius has been accused of being a Stoic defendant of the idea of apatheia, but I've recently finished a study showing that actually the direct source of Evagrius is Porphyry. So even though the term may be originally Stoic, it is filtered through Porphyry's Neoplatonic worldview, and it fits in much better to Evagrius' own thought than the Stoic notion. Again, the intellect, the activity of the intellect, the activity of the nous is essentially an act of discernment and immediate apprehension. It's not a fantasia, it's not a presentation. This is also important. And sense perception works in a way analogous to intellection. This is something that is you find in Plato and Aristotle, and Evagrius really insists on this point. There are several passages where he speaks about perception in very Aristotelian terms, and he lays the groundwork for a, let's say, philosophical understanding of spiritual perception. And of course, immaterial beings, the noetic and God, can be perceived by the intellectual senses. So the Platonic antecedent I was speaking about comes from Plutarch, a Middle Platonic author, quite early for the theory of spiritual perception, and it's related to the daimon of Socrates. So we read in Plutarch's treatise on this topic, on the genius of the daimon of Socrates, that Socrates had an intellect which was pure and free from passion, and communicating with the body but little for necessary ends. And Socrates was so sensitive and delicate as to respond to at once to what reached him. So what reached him, one would conjecture, was not spoken language, but the unuttered words of a daimon, of an intermediary being, not a demon, making voiceless contact with his intelligence by their sense alone. For speech is like a blow. When we converse with one another, the words are forced to our ears, and the soul is compelled to take them in, whereas the intelligence of the higher power guides the gifted soul, which requires no blows, by the touch of its thought. So here we already have the basic concept of intellectual hearing, that is defined as hearing, but it is not physical. It does not work through the bodily organs of hearing. And a little later on, Plutarch adds that in very truth our recognition of one another's thoughts through the medium of spoken word is like groping in the dark, whereas the thoughts of daimons are luminous and shed their light on demonic men, meaning on purified men that sort of almost transcend the human state. Their thoughts have no needs of verbs or nouns, which men use as symbols in their intercourse, and thereby behold mere counterfeits and likenesses of what is present in thought, but are unaware of the originals, except for those persons who are illuminated, as I have said, by some special and demonic radiance. So here we already have, again, the connection between light, illumination, and spiritual senses in Plutarch. I mean, this is first century, so this is why I wrote here antecedents to the doctrine of spiritual senses, but I think it's much older than we think. So usually the origin of this theory is linked to Plotinus and Origen, which is of course true. I mean, they are the first to really systematize this, but we should really look much further behind. So authors like Plutarch, Philo, and Clement already have this in some sense. And from Origen, there are many developments within the Christian ascetic tradition. Evagrius, Macarius has his own developments, Diadochus and many others. And of course, the issue involved in the 4th century, at the end of the 4th century, is also the discussion of Messianism, which was discussed or mentioned a few times in this context, which I won't go into because it's would lead much too far. But the question of whether our perception of God is purely physical or really bodily, explicitly bodily, was raised at the end of the 4th century. And it is also partially as a reaction to this that the doctrine of spiritual perception is enforced. So, for example, in Orthodox. Okay. So just briefly about Evagrius. Of course, the theory of spiritual perception in Evagrius is very complex, but just brought some of the key passages to understand the background to Joseph Isaiah for later on. So a brief definition of spiritual perception in the Theological 137, which is only preserved in Syriac, is that spiritual perception is the impassibility of the rational soul, which is affected by the grace of God. So basically, Evagrius's idea is that there is an identity between the state of passionlessness or impassibility and spiritual perception. The two go hand in hand. Further on in the 2nd century, in the second century of the Kephalaya, Evagrius speaks about 5 intellectual perceptions or senses. Theas aesthesis. The intellect has 5 spiritual senses by means of which it perceives the matters that have an affinity to it, to the divine perception. Sight reveals its intelligible objects in a bare form. Through hearing, it receives the logoi concerning them. Smell delights in the smell that is alien from all deceit, and the mouth receives their tastes. Through tact, through touching, the intellect is confirmed by grasping the exact demonstration, Apophaticism, it's a very Aristotelian term, of objects. So what I gather, how I understand this passage, and also the Syriac tradition understood it, is that there is there are some degrees of assent. So first we have some sort of intellectual sight, and hearing is something above that. Linked to it is a sort of smell and taste, which is linked to the enjoyment that one receives in the knowledge of these spiritual things. And touching is a sort of end point, the exact demonstration of things. But this is not the end. So in a way, Evagrius says we have sight, hearing, taste, and touch, taste, smell, and touch in a sort of ascending order. But above that, the highest point of spiritual perception is actually this vision of God. And for this, Evagrius makes a very interesting distinction between the left eye and the right eye of the soul. So on Evil Thoughts, chapter 42, Evagrius says that demonic thoughts, here in a bad sense of demons, blind the soul's left eye, which is directed towards the contemplation of created things, but those concepts that imprint on and shape our governing faculty darken the right eye, which at the time of prayer contemplates the blessed light of the Holy Trinity. So it's an interesting distinction between the left and the right eye, which, well, in a bodily perception, one would not make, probably. So this is just to the background in Evagrius. Then to the question of the apophatic tendency in Evagrius. Today in the morning we already heard, as Father Grayson said, that there is an strong apophatic tendency in Evagrius, but usually he's associated with the concept of knowledge. Evagrius is the Gnostic, the one who speaks about the knowledge of God, not the ignorance about knowledge. But that's also present in his thought, and at least the Syriac tradition read it this way, mainly based on a passage that is textually difficult. In the same Gnostica, it is said, "Blessed is the one who has reached the ignorance that cannot be surpassed." And in the second translation of the same passage, it says, "Blessed is the one who has reached the knowledge that cannot be surpassed." And this is due to a very easily made mistake in the Syriac. If you take one L out, you can read knowledge instead of ignorance. So regardless of what the textual correct reading of this is, the entire Syriac tradition read it in the sense of ignorance. So in this way they were reading Evagrius also as a master of apophatic theology and of the ignorance above knowledge. And there are other passages that sort of confirm that Evagrius might have had this concept in mind of an ignorance above knowledge. So moving to the Dionysian corpus, which I only will mention briefly, sort of the other way around. If we take Dionysius, who is usually regarded as the master of apophatic theology, there is also an idea of mystical perception, of divine perceiving in the mystical theology. This is from Mystical Theology 4:11. This is a famous passage that all the mystical authors in Syriac quote, starting from Babai up until Joseph Isaiah and later. It should be known that we employ letters, syllables, names, writing, and words because of the senses. When, however, our soul is moved towards the divine things through the action of the Spirit, these senses of bodily perception become superfluous, just as the spiritual powers of the soul are superfluous when the soul becomes deiform and shines in the rays of exalted light through those eyeless, blind movements. So movements is actually epipole, which is also a philosophical term from late Greek Aristotelian and Neoplatonic text, meaning a sort of direct, immediate apprehension of things. So even at the highest state of union with God, there is something that Dionysius calls blind apprehensions, rather than movements. It is translated as movements in the Syriac, but I think movement here has its technical term of apprehension, movement of thought. Okay, this is, we can skip this. It's just to show that I will just speak about the 8th century, so forgive my title, which also mentions the 7th century. I will skip directly to the 8th. So Joseph Hazaia, of course, was one of the most important mystics of the 8th century, of the golden age of East Syriac mysticism. He spent his entire life around this region in multiple monasteries. This is also the same region that John of Taliata spent his life in, and of course we have plenty of his works preserved. So what about spiritual hearing? I don't know how much time do I have left? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay, try to make it. So I won't talk about spiritual perception in general, but really focus on some passages on spiritual hearing, and I think, because time is short, I'll just read them out and enjoy them together, because they're very nice passages and we can maybe discuss them in the discussion round. So what really struck me is the fact that Joseph is really obsessed with this expression as a katine, subtle sounds or ethereal sounds that he uses all over the place. And my point really is, in a nutshell, that this is somehow taken from Evagrius, which we have seen that in Evagrius, spiritual hearing has a very technical meaning at an intermediary level of mystical knowledge, not really the highest form of knowledge. Whereas for Joseph Hazaia, apparently, this theme of subtle sounds of the angels, of ethereal, immaterial sounds of the angels, is something that starts before the ascetic reaches impassibility, which is not the last stage, but really the beginning of the mystical life. And it accompanies the ascetic up until the highest form of mystical union. So this is something where Joseph probably, in a way, goes beyond Evagrius and gives to spiritual hearing a much more central position in his thought, in his mystical theology than anybody previously. So the subtle sounds that we hear within our souls are a sign that she has begun to draw near to the place of impassibility. If she possesses love and humanity, blessed is that soul, for she will easily enter into the rest of our Lord. So before we reach impassibility or approaching impassibility, we already start hearing the subtle sounds. But further on, he also says, when you see the color of crystal, of the color of the heavens in your soul, this is Evagrius, understand that the contemplation of the incorporeal being, so this is in the Evagrian system above the stage before, that the theory of incorporeal beings wishes to show herself to you. And blessed are you in that hour if you possess the activity of the second sense, namely hearing, for they will lead you to their Lord through their subtle utterances or sounds, the same expression. And this is just to show that the expression is not really found in many texts. This is the only other passage outside of the mystical text of Joseph that I could find the expression used in. This is a later recension of the Vita of Ephraim. This is just to show that the concept is very restricted to the 8th century authors. And further on, he also says, the subtle sounds that are heard in this place do not reach the composite nature of a tongue of flesh. So just to make sure that we're speaking about spiritual hearing and not bodily hearing. The intellect that is purified from the material passions and which has preserved the holy seed of its first creation, so return to an Adamic state, is judged worthy to have its tongue loosened or simplified and to sing with them, namely the incorporeal natures, spiritual praises. Blessed is the soul in which the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, the Spirit of Revelations, makes a dwelling place. So this is sort of even higher above than the states that we discussed earlier. And then we reach the place of limpidity, which is even higher. And here, Joseph also says that there is a sort of spiritual hearing, but he also speaks of silence, because all of the faculties of the soul and the body remain silent. So we have this sound within silence, as it were. So believe me truly, brethren, when I say unto you that whenever the mind hears the sound of the spiritual beings with its intelligible ears, all its work is performed high above the senses of the body and of its own faculties, which become silent and restful as in sleep, through the happiness which it receives from the glorification of the spiritual beings. Even if the body is asleep, these faculties of the mind have no rest on account of their service with the spiritual beings. And then in some of the unedited chapters, it is said that the baptism of the intellect, so there are 3 types of baptism. The baptism of the intellect is the highest type of baptism, is a spiritual experience, is a contemplation of the Holy Trinity, together with the contemplation of incorporeal beings and spiritual prayer, the outburst of words, the subtle sounds or chants of the spiritual minds, and the praise of the new world, and the perception of the mysteries of this heavenly kingdom. So here we have a sort of spiritual hearing and also outburst of one's own praises that are spiritual in a very high stage of the foretaste of the new world, of the world in the heavenly kingdom. So what I suggest we have here is, of course, it is a transformation of the soul. It is a foretaste of the highest stage of the knowledge of God that sort of gives a foretaste of the new world, of the renewed creation in the eschaton. But it's not just simply silence, or it's not simply darkness, as it were. It is also a transformation into a liturgical union with the divine, with the angels, so that the mystic himself hears the sounds of these spiritual beings chanting and praising God, and he joins them in these outbursts of chanting himself, which are also above the senses, one might argue, or one might say. And this is just, I think, the final passage which I'll read. This is a description of this experience of the new world. And wondering at the sweetness of spiritual delight, the ascetic stays in gentle silence without any movement. He rests and rejoices as if being in the way of life of the new world. For he is overcome by the desire for the intelligible things, and though his movements and senses remain inactive, his tongue remains silent for any spoken word. But then, Joseph says, and he receives a word, so he's silent, but then he receives a word, and he remains in the amazement of ignorance above knowledge. His intellect and his understanding shine in the perception of the new life. He burns with unquenchable desire and rejoices at the innocence of the fisherman's knowledge. His heart's thought converses with the spiritual beings in hidden prayer. He is made into another person, for he sees and sees not, hears and hears not, he eats and eats not. So this is a very nice passage about the experience of the heavenly kingdom. And again, we see a sort of paradoxical tension between the complete silence of all the senses and of all our activities, intellectual activities, but again, we receive a word or a type of praise of the new world. And with this, I just come to some conclusions or points for further discussion. First, as I showed, there is quite a few common ground between late antique Platonic ethics and Christian asceticism, which we should look at with a fresh eye and beyond the polemics between the two. There is, within the Syriac tradition, a strongly apophatic reading of Evagrius that we should also take into consideration. This is not the usual way one reads Evagrius. The subtle sounds in Joseph are a trademark of his mysticism. They accompany the ascetic from the first steps towards impassibility up until the vision of the new world, which is the highest type of knowledge of the divine that one can reach. And then a suggestion whether this could be also coined with the term Unia Liturgica, which is used, I think, first by Peter Schaeffer in describing some of the early stages of Jewish mysticism, namely that the believers join into the celebration and chanting of God. But it is a mystical Christian reinterpretation of this Unia Liturgica in the New World. And of course, finally and more generally, we should think about reevaluating the importance of spiritual perception in Christian spirituality and mysticism, precisely in those authors and trends that were not discussed until now in previous literature. Thank you very much.